Hi everybody, welcome back. This week we'll be discussing consequential moral theories. A consequential moral theory, or a consequentialist moral theory, is a theory about right or wrong action, or a systematic approach to right or wrong action that bases decisions about right or wrong on results, or consequences. We'll talk mainly about two different types of theory today, egoism and utilitarianism. And next week, Wednesday, next set of slides, we'll discuss more in depth some of the variations and objections to utilitarianism specifically. So first, a little bit about moral theories. Moral theories are really just a group of principles about which course of action is most desirable or makes the most sense. These principles are systematically related in an integrated way, and they represent, in many cases, sort of the culmination of a long history of thinking about action and decision-making about actions. What we're talking about when we talk about a moral theory is just an organized way, that is a systematic way, of looking at what the facts of situations are, what questions about those facts are morally relevant, and what kinds of actions we ought to take in response to the situations that we're in. Now, sometimes people share the same moral view. That is, for instance, we might both be consequentialists. And if we are, that is, if you think that we should figure out what course of action to take in a given situation based on what would produce the best results, and I feel like the best way to decide how to act is based on which course of action produces the best result, it's very easy to have a conversation about what the right thing to do is. So, for instance, if we're talking about whether or not euthanasia is permissible, and we both agree that the thing that should decide whether or not euthanasia is permissible is whether or not it produces the best results. That is, maybe the most happiness possible. Well, you might say, hey, euthanasia has this flaw. It frightens people, right? The prospect of having euthanasia available is disconcerting to some people. It makes them upset. And it also may lead to a kind of pressure on elderly people to kill themselves or to engage in the act of euthanasia when they otherwise wouldn't want to. And you might think, hey, that's a bad result of allowing euthanasia. On the other hand, I would say something like, if I disagreed, I would say something like, well, euthanasia is mostly positive. The results are mostly to end suffering, to ease pain, to give people choices which they like to have. And so for the most part, allowing euthanasia, as a legal matter, would be a positive moral thing. Now, we could disagree about the right decision, but if we agree about what the standard should be for making the decision, that is, if we share a moral theory, we both think consequences are what matter, in that case, well, we both have a sort of set of consequences that we think are likely. We could do the research to figure out which one of these happens, and if they do, which one creates more suffering. So we would look at societies where euthanasia was permitted, and we would gauge the level of satisfaction with death and dying in those societies, and we would gauge the satisfaction with death and dying in societies where euthanasia was not permitted. We would say, okay, well, people seem to be happier in one situation or the other. And then, since we both agree what the standard should be, good results, we would choose the answer that produces the best results. And at least in principle, we could come to an agreement about the facts. Presumably, we could agree about what the fact of the matter is, given enough research. And as long as we have the same moral standard, we could then come to some agreement about the appropriate course of action. Now, of course, not everybody thinks that the results are the only thing that matters. Right? A number of people think more than results, motivations matter, or respecting individuals' rights matters, even if respecting rights or being concerned about somebody's motivation doesn't produce the best result. And in those cases, the facts that we think are relevant may differ. So for instance, if you think somebody has a right to end their own life whenever they choose, you might think euthanasia is permissible, while still believing that, for the most part, having euthanasia available makes people less happy. Right? So it's possible to have to advocate different moral theories, in which case the facts that you think are relevant will tend to be different. So roughly I'll organize the moral theories we'll talk about into consequential and non-consequential moral theories. The consequential theories will be egoism and utilitarianism. Non-consequentialist theories, virtue ethics and deontology. And we'll talk more about those as the course proceeds. So, consequentialist ethical theories are the most straightforward of the bunch. Actions are good if they tend to produce good consequences. Actions are bad if they produce bad consequences. Consequentialist theories only think about ethics in terms of the consequences of actions. So morally correct decisions for the consequentialist are determined by the results, or the consequences. Good consequence equals a good choice. Bad consequence equals a bad choice. So literally, this kind of position is an ends justify the means moral theory. Right? The idea is actions are legitimized, actions are justified, actions are morally acceptable if the consequences are good. They're less morally acceptable as the consequences become less good, and as the consequences become worse and worse, they become more and more unacceptable. Right? So it's a really straightforward position. The only thing that matters is not motivation or concern or following any universal principle you think exists. The only thing that makes a difference to the consequentialist is the production of good consequences. So motivation doesn't matter. Character of the person taking the action doesn't matter. Being concerned about human rights even doesn't matter. The thing that matters is producing a good consequence. So principles like fairness don't count for much in a consequentialist system, right? Fairness would only be valuable to the consequentialist when and if it produces a good result. So if being unfair produced a good result, being unfair would be morally acceptable to the consequentialist. If being fair produces a good result, then being fair would be morally acceptable to the consequentialist. So there's really three dominant views within consequentialism: egoism, and then two varieties of utilitarianism. Today we'll talk about egoism and discuss some of the problems with egoism. And then we'll talk about the first sort of utilitarianism, what your textbook calls classical utilitarianism. And then in Wednesday's video, we'll discuss the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism and how that answers some objections to the utilitarian moral theory. Remember though, consequentialist theories, only the results matter. And here's a sort of chart of how you might think about moral theories. We'll fill in the non-consequentialist side as we continue. So, the main question for a consequentialist is, how do we produce happiness? But preliminary to that, because typically that's thought of as the sort of the good result, right? Positive consequences, people are happy. So, whose happiness matters? Whose happiness counts? Well, egoists and utilitarians answer this question differently. On the moral theory of egoism, it's only my happiness that counts. For the egoist, self-interest is the key to moral decision-making. Sometimes this can involve the feelings of others, but only as they affect the person making the choice. Right? On the egoist view, doing the right thing, that is, being a good person, is only a matter of looking after your own self-interest. Ayn Rand advocates this view of moral reasoning. Right? The idea is each person is responsible for their own happiness, and doing the right thing in any case means maximizing your own happiness. Sometimes that will mean other people are miserable, sometimes it means other people are happy. The only job for the egoist, morally speaking, is to look after your own happiness. Utilitarian, on the other hand, thinks that happiness generally is valuable, that it's not just my happiness that's important, but happiness is valuable for its own sake. And so it's not my happiness that's important, it's everything who is capable of being happy. Right? Satisfaction in life is valuable no matter whose it is. And so for the utilitarian, the answer to the question whose happiness counts is everybody's happiness counts. We're happy kind of individually, like we each have different levels of happiness. But the idea for the utilitarian is to produce the greatest amount of happiness possible, right? To maximize happiness. And this means we have to consider the desires of everybody involved in the decision. So sometimes this will mean also including, say, my cat. Right? If my cat comes along and steps in front of the screen, I have to decide on the utilitarian view, do I just smack the cat and shoo her away? Or do I let her kind of hang out at the computer? And I have to consider not only your happiness and my happiness, but also the fact that the cat would like to be here. Right? And, I still may come to the conclusion, well, hey, your happiness and my happiness override the cat's happiness. We can produce greatest utility by moving the cat. Still, the cat matters, even if only a small amount. Okay, so egoism. Right? Egoism is a moral theory based on self-interest. The idea is behaviors are good if they result in the self-interest, the happiness of the individual agent or the person who's acting. It's consequentialist because it focuses only on the results of a person's actions. A person's motivation is not relevant. Right? The thing that matters is whether or not the person does something that produces their own happiness or not. So whether they're acting maliciously or not, if it makes them happy, it's good for the egoist. If it makes them unhappy, it's bad. So somebody who is self-sacrificial, who is altruistic, or who is an attempt at altruism, trying to do something good for somebody else, even though it causes them some suffering. For instance, if you have kids, if you make a sacrifice for your children, and you buy them that Christmas present that they really want, even though it means that you'll have to pick up some extra shifts at work. You think, well, this doesn't make me happy. It's not what I really want to do. I'd rather not work, but I'll do it anyway because it'll make my kid happy. Well, the egoist is going to say that's probably a bad idea because the motivation, right, caring for other people, is not such a great motivation, right? And it doesn't matter. The result is negative. Makes you kind of unhappy. You'd be happier if you didn't do it. So the egoist is going to say that kind of self-sacrificial behavior that makes you unhappy, don't do it. On the other hand, somebody sort of malicious really wants to torture and malign other people in their lives, thinks it's kind of fun to give people a really hard time and make them unhappy. Well, if it makes you happy, then the egoist says, go right ahead and do it. And that's the thing that you in fact should do, the egoist thinks. It's not just that you can act maliciously if it makes you happy. You should act maliciously if it makes you happy, on the egoist view. It really is purely self-interested. So the idea is a sort of outgrowth of laissez-faire capitalism. The presumption is that individuals ought to act for their own self-interest, even at the expense of other people, if they need to, if that's what will make them happiest. Right? So we ought to act in our own self-interest, even if it means harming other people, if what that means is it makes us happier. Now, in most cases, and for most egoists, there's a consideration of enlightened self-interest. Right? So it turns out that being a malicious person and running around giving people a hard time is not usually in our long-term self-interest. So in the short run, if you're kind of a nasty person, you might really enjoy giving people a hard time, making them sad or uncomfortable. But in the long run, if you treat people that way, they're very likely to look at you askance and to sort of treat you badly. And so in the long run, even if it makes you happy to be malicious to people, most of the time it's probably going to be better not to do that, because those people will ostracize you and not want to hang out with you and maybe even be cruel back to you. Or they may just see you as not a very nice person, and it's nice to be seen as a nice person. So for a number of long-term reasons, it's usually better not to be malicious in your own interests. It's usually not in your own interests to sort of treat people poorly, because a lot of that comes back. Now, if you could treat somebody poorly and it makes you happy and you can get away with it, on the egoist view, that's just fine. It's just, it turns out that it's usually in our interest to treat people with some sort of respect. Also, treating people as if they mattered to us is sometimes important, because people do. So for instance, if you're taking extra shifts at work so you can buy that present your kid really wants, it may make you a little bit sad. Right? You may not want, it may make you less happy than you could be to be at work. Maybe you'd rather not be at work. But it could be that that's offset by seeing your kid really happy with that new present. Right? So it could be that you actually care about other people's feelings, that other people's feelings are connected to your own, such that seeing somebody else happy makes you happy. So an egoist principle in an enlightened way, that is enlightened would take into account enlightened self-interest. So it's still the claim that you ought to do what is best for you, that it's the right thing to do, morally speaking, to always do what is in your own interest. But we can consider enlightened self-interest. That is self-interest that accounts for the fact that other people's feelings probably matter to you, and your long-term interests may be different than your short-term interests. And since you're likely to live quite a while longer, it's probably a good idea to consider, at least in part, the value of your long-term interests. Now, egoism's got some problems. The primary one is the root of it. Most people who think that egoism is the best moral theory hold that view because they believe a psychological fact. They believe that people can only act on self-interest. So a lot of people think every decision you make, every choice you make, every action you take is because you think taking that action is the best thing to do for you. Now, that fact is called psychological egoism. It's not moral egoism, it's psychological egoism. It's a fact about the way the world works, or a proposed fact. And the idea is, if we can only act on self-interest, then the moral thing to do must be acting on self-interest. And there's two major problems with that line of reasoning, with that way of getting to egoism. The first is, it doesn't seem to be the case. Right? So it looks like people sometimes do act altruistically, that is, without regard for their own self-interest, but rather for the interests of others. So the sort of paradigmatic example of this is the soldier who throws himself on a grenade to save his friends' lives. The idea there is the person doesn't throw themselves on the grenade for themselves, right? They throw themselves on the grenade for their friends. It's not that they're making themselves happy. Rather, they're helping other people. So it looks like people can act based on motivations other than self-interest. And if you have children, you've probably thought about this in that context. You probably acted a number of ways that wasn't in your best interest necessarily, but was in the best interest of your children. Broken up with somebody because the relationship was good for you but not for your kids, or moved to a neighborhood that wasn't as convenient and nice for you but had a better school district for your children. Right, lots of ways that we put other people's needs ahead of our own. We do that a lot, actually. We think about other people's needs and we put them above our own needs, right? The claim of the psychological egoist is that we can't do that. That as a matter of fact, it's impossible for somebody to put another human being's needs above their own. That we can only act based on our own desires or our own interests. So that looks like it's a false claim. Now, of course, you could say, well, the guy who throws himself on a grenade does that so that he can live with himself afterwards, right? Because he thinks, oh, I couldn't possibly live with myself if I let my friends die. So the only thing I could do and still be happy is throw myself on the grenade. But that's a real stretch to think the only way I can be happy is to kill myself. It's really tortured logic. And likewise, with children, you might think, well, I make my kids happy only so that I can be happy. And that seems wrong, right? I mean, it seems like people make their children happy because it makes them happy, yes, but also because they want their kids to be happy even when it doesn't necessarily make them happy for their kids to be happy, right? So, for instance, if you move to a neighborhood you really don't want to live in, that's really inconvenient and uncomfortable, in order to help your children be in a good school district. Right? It makes them happier, makes you happy to see them happy, but still the reason you're doing it is not because it makes you happy to see them happy. It's because it makes them happy. Right? Now, you could explain any human action based on self-interest. So you could explain any action you take as the only thing that you could do in that situation because that's what you thought was best for you. Two things, though. One, you probably don't think about it that way already. So you probably do things that you know aren't in your own best interests. You drink too much one night. You put off doing your homework when you know you should go ahead and do it anyway. You skip going to the gym when you know you really should. You eat that extra piece of dessert even though you already decided you really shouldn't have dessert tonight. And you know it's not in your own interest, but you do it anyway. So we're constantly doing things that really aren't in our self-interest, and we kind of know that. But also, even if you could explain everything you do in terms of your own self-interest, that doesn't mean that that's the best explanation. So, for instance, I could explain everything I do. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. I could explain everything I do as simply a response to the invisible leprechauns that move my body around. So it turns out that everything I do all the time is only controlled by little invisible leprechauns who move me around. And I can't see them or feel them, and I don't know they're there, but every action I take is because the little leprechauns make me do it. Notice, I could explain every action I take as the fault of the little leprechauns. But that's a terrible explanation, right? It makes no sense to say little invisible leprechauns made me do everything I do. Right? It's an explanation. I could use it in every case, but it's not a good explanation. Now, in a lot of cases, self-interest may be a good explanation, but the point is, just because you can always use it doesn't mean it's always the reason. Likewise, I could explain everything I do as altruistic. I could say every action I take is because it helps somebody else. Why do I teach this class? Because it helps you. Why do I raise my children? Because it helps them. Why do I drive my car to work instead of riding my bicycle? Well, because it allows me to get places faster, which is better for you. Why do I eat things that I know I shouldn't eat because they're unhealthy? Well, because I want to keep the cake manufacturers in business. I don't want Dunkin' Donuts going out of business. That would be terrible, right? I'm just trying to do my part. I could explain every single action in terms of self-interest, or in terms of altruism, or every action in terms of invisible leprechauns. Just being able to explain something one way doesn't mean it's the best explanation. And so that's a major problem with this idea that we move from psychological egoism to moral egoism. A second problem is the fact-value distinction. And you'll hear me talk about this a couple times over the course of the semester. Facts, that is, the way things tend to be, the way things are, and the way things ought to be, are not necessarily the same, right? So the way the world is one way, and that doesn't mean it's the best one. Just because it is this way doesn't mean it should be. So for instance, people are racist, but that doesn't mean that they morally should be, right? Likewise, if people are, even if people were completely self-interested, that doesn't mean that that's right. That doesn't mean that's a good way to be, right? So if for instance, the way I'm built, right, my sort of biological dispositions are that if I'm hungry and you're eating a sandwich, I walk by you, I don't know, the way I'm built, I guess, is I just grab your sandwich and eat it. I'm hungry after all, and you have a sandwich. That doesn't make it a good thing. Even if that's the way I am, doesn't mean that's the way I ought to be. And so even if we are purely self-interested, it doesn't mean that that's what we should be. Those are two major problems with ethical egoism that is derived from psychological egoism. Additionally, even if you think egoism is unrelated, that is, moral egoism is unrelated to psychological egoism, there's a second problem with moral egoism. That is, it creates a sort of a two-tier system. So the moral egoist thinks everybody should act in their own self-interest as long as their self-interest accords with mine. But when there's a conflict, and it's my self-interest or your self-interest, well, you should act in my self-interest, clearly. But in any other situations, always act on your own self-interest. So there's act in my self-interest, and then everybody else should act in their self-interest. And that's the two tiers. The top tier is act in your own self-interest, and then for everybody else, always act in your own self-interest, unless it conflicts with my self-interest, and then go ahead and act in my self-interest. That's the egoist view. And it seems to pick out individuals as sort of special. Right? It's like, whatever I want is the right thing, even if it's not what you want. And whatever you want is the right thing, so long as it's also the thing that I want. That's the sort of, that's the difficulty at the end of the day with egoism, right? Is that it wants to pick out me as supremely important, and you can be important to yourself as long as it doesn't conflict with me being more important, right? And that inconsistency is a problem with a systematic moral theory. Right? It seems to have a systematic problem. That is, it always puts the person applying it in a separate category from everybody else. So that's a sort of systematic problem with it as a theory. So an alternative is a utilitarian moral theory. Now, the idea of utilitarian moral theory is to produce maximum utility. Utility is just usefulness at producing happiness. So an action's utility corresponds to the amount of happiness that it produces or the amount of pain that is avoided. The utilitarian moral theory is based on this one principle, centrally, the greatest happiness principle. The principle is this: an action is right in proportion to its tendency to produce the greatest happiness or the greatest good for the greatest number. So for a utilitarian, the right action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. We'll talk mostly about act utilitarianism. This is something that Jeremy Bentham originated. This is just after the Protestant Reformation in England, and Bentham is working to develop a moral system that isn't based on any single religious tradition. So we've just had the Catholic and Protestant split, and all of the tension that's come with Catholics and Protestants fighting for control over both the people's minds and the political system. And so what Jeremy Bentham is working to do is to develop a system of morality that is separate from any particular religious tradition and grounded in the world here. So the idea for the utilitarian is very much in keeping with the tradition of the Industrial Revolution and the development of a merchant class, right? It's very much of this world and aimed at producing satisfaction of people's desires, right? So for Bentham, the right thing to do in any situation is the action that produces the greatest good, most happiness for the most people. And it's not about adhering to some universal or divinely inspired principle, but rather it's very this worldly, about producing happiness for people here. So there's 5 steps in a utilitarian reasoning. Right? First, what's the main question? Right? What's the decision I have to make? And the decision could be throw myself on the grenade or not, save for my kid's birthday present. Choose your moral decision to make. Consider the options. Right? What are the different options we could take as far as what sorts of actions could we take in response to this question? Usually there are more than 2 potential actions we can take. And then, third step, this is where it starts to differ from egoism. The third step, we consider all of the different people whose lives would be affected by our different responses. And then the idea is to determine the utility, that is the sort of happiness value of each potential option. And then number 5, we choose the option with the highest net utility. That is, choose the option that produces the most satisfaction of desire for all the people who have a stake in the decision that you're making. What this involves is quantifying happiness. We're supposed to look at a situation and decide which of our actions is going to produce the most happiness. And that's a hard thing to do, trying to decide what the outcome of an action is before we take it. But that's what we're doing anytime we try to maximize results. We want to know, what are my options, which of the options produces the best result, then follow that option. And for the utilitarian, it's which of these options produces the best result for me and everybody else who will be affected. So, Bentham, knowing this is difficult, gives us some considerations that we should take into account when deciding which option will lead to the most desire satisfaction. One of these is to consider the intensity of the pleasure or pain that would be produced. So, for instance, if I have some names on the screen here, I'll tell you a little story. Jim he's kind of a lazy roustabout, right? And he likes to sleep on the sofa of his friend Bill's house, right? And Bill usually lets Jim sleep on the couch. He's kind of a good friend, and he's in some ways enabling Jim, but he likes having Jim around. Ed, Tim, and Jill are Bill's kids, and they like Uncle Jim pretty well, And they don't really mind that Uncle Jim sleeps on the couch. Occasionally they poke him or prod him. And occasionally Uncle Jim's kind of sleeping on the couch when they'd like to be sitting on it. But for the most part, they like Uncle Jim. And Sue is Bill's spouse. And Sue really understands Jim spending a night on the couch every now and then when something goes wrong in his life. But Jim's been on the couch for 2 months now, and Sue is kind of fed up with it. Now, we have to decide. Should we let Jim sleep on the couch or not? Moral decision. Do we kick Jim out into the cold? Do we tell him he can't stay longer than a week? He has a week to find a place to live. Do we tell Jim he can stay as long as he likes? Lots of different options for how to approach the situation of Jim sleeping on the couch. First thing Bentham asks us to consider is the intensity of the pleasure that would be produced by an option. So for instance, we'll work out the calculation. This is utilitarian calculus. We do the calculation for one option, and then we do it for another, and then maybe a third option. So let's say the first option is we kick Jim out. We say, just hit the bricks now. Good luck finding a place. You can sleep in your car for the next week if that's what it takes. We don't care. So does that make Jim happy or sad? Right? Does it produce happiness in him or misery? How intense is it? So if it produces happiness, we get a positive number. If it produces misery, a negative number. I mean, we could also do this on a scale of 1 to 100 or something like that, but I think positive 10 to negative 10 is my preference for how to run these calculations. Jim's level of happiness is Jim's level of happiness is going to be marked by probably a negative number. Right, so presumably we'd get a negative number for the level of satisfaction that Jim experiences. Let's see if I can set this up so I can type into it. Right, so Jim, let's say, ends up with, I don't know what, a -6. He's really pretty unhappy, maybe even a -8. He's kicked out in the cold right now. What about Bill? Right, and I'll tell you what, let's give it another option too. What happens if we tell Jim he can stay as long as he likes? Right, he's ecstatic. Right, it's a +8 for him. Right, that would make him, we presume, very happy. Now, what about for Bill? Now, remember, Bill kind of likes having Jim around, but he's also kind of off by Jim spending forever on the couch. So, do we think that Bill ought to be able to stay in? Or do you think Bill's going to be made happy by kicking Jim out immediately, or sad? Maybe he's neutral on it, right? Maybe he's not positively or negatively affected. He's kind of torn. I mean, I'm just snowballing this. You need an actual situation with actual facts to do a more robust job of this. Well, okay, what about the other option? He can stay as long as he wants. Well, that's probably going to make Bill a little unhappy, right? Maybe not miserable, but a little bit unhappy. And then for Ed, Tim, and Jill, maybe we'll just count them as a bunch. Okay, we'll say these three. Will it make them happy to have Jim kicked out or sad? It seems like it's going to make them kind of sad. And if Uncle Jim gets to stay forever, does this make them happy or sad? I don't know, maybe it makes them a little bit happy. Maybe it's a +2. And what about for Sue, the spouse? Remember, she does not like Jim sleeping on the couch, even for a little while, but she's supportive of a little while, but she really is not interested in having Jim there and kind of resents it. Maybe Sue, if we kick him out today, she's happier than she would be if he stayed. So maybe for Sue, it's what, a +6? And for the option where we decide to let him stay forever, she's really angry, right? -8. She gets super upset about something like that. So now we've calculated a sort of relative intensity and type of response to two different options. But Bentham says, hey, there's other things to consider. For instance, the duration or length of the pleasure or pain. Like, how long is it going to last? How long will this pleasure or pain last? So how long will the positive experience, or how long will this negative experience of being kicked out last for Jim? Probably going to last a little while, right? He's probably going to be living in his car for a bit, right? So maybe a -5. And how long will the positive experience of getting to stay as long as he wants last? Probably quite a while. Give him a +8. Now, for Bill, how long will the kind of neutral experience of, well, if he's got a neutral experience, maybe we just leave it at neutral for the duration. How long will his negative experience of his buddy staying on the couch forever last? Probably a long time. If he stays forever, remember Bill doesn't really want him to stay forever, it's going to last a long time. So the duration is quite substantial. Now, for Ed, Tim, and Jill, remember they had a sort of negative response to Uncle Jim's being kicked out right now. So how long would kicking him out right now be sad for them? Probably not that long. Maybe until Uncle Jim finds a new place. So give him the same response as Jim. And then how long would the positive response of Uncle Jim getting to stay kind of as long as he wants to last? I mean, they'd be happy about it, but maybe not as ecstatic as Jim with the +8. Right, so let's give it a +4. The kids like having Jim around. And Sue, well, if they kick him out, she's happy. How long does that happiness last? Probably a little while. She's probably going to be happy about that for a bit. Maybe not as long as Jim is unhappy about it, but happy. And how long will she be miserable if Jim stays? Sort of indefinitely. Quite a long time. Probably just as long as Jim is happy. Maybe even longer. Because even if Jim eventually leaves, Sue may resent that for a bit longer. Okay, so now we've got an intensity of pleasure or pain and a duration of it. But notice one of the things we're doing here is we're trying to decide how sure we are, or what's going to happen in the future. And when we're trying to predict the future, there's always an element of uncertainty. Right? When you try to produce a consequence, you're kind of predicting what will happen if you choose this action or that action. What will the consequence of your action be? It's always a predictive affair. When we predict something, we can't ever be 100% sure. So what's the certainty that this will be the kind of response that we're going to have? So how sure are we that if Jim is kicked out today, he's going to be pretty unhappy? We are pretty sure about that, right? So we can be fairly certain. So again, we're contributing to this negative response. Our certainty supports that negative feeling. And then on the other end of things, how certain are we that if he gets to stay for a very long time, he will be pretty happy about that? Here we want to also support Jim's happiness, but realize that it may not be such a thrilling thing over the long run for Jim to be living on the couch, right? Maybe he would be better off some other ways. So how sure are we about this? I don't know. Maybe not terribly, but we have some confidence that he would like to stay. So we support that positive number with our degree of certainty here between 1 and 10. And then for Bill, how sure are we that he'd be roughly neutral to kicking Jim out today or not? We can be fairly certain about that. So we support that neutral number, say. And then how sure are we that he's going to have a sort of negative experience to Jim being allowed to stay for quite a long time? Again, we can be pretty sure about that, but maybe not as sure as we would be about Jim's happiness. And then the kids, how sure are we that they would be sad if we kicked Jim out? We can be pretty certain about that one. Kids are predictable in that way. How sure are we that they would be happy if Uncle Jim gets to stay? There, I want to say we're probably less certain. Right? We still want to be. We have some confidence in it, but it's not absolutely certain. Kids are fickle in who they like having around sometimes. And then, how sure are we about Sue, who's had widely expressed views about this? I'm pulling this from a personal experience, if you can't tell. So for Sue, I think you can be fairly confident that she will be happy if we kick Jim out today. And I think we can be pretty confident that she will be unhappy if we tell him he can stay as long as he wants. Maybe not to the 10 point, but pretty high. Okay. Now, although we've made predictions about what's happening and how long it's likely to last and kind of how sure we are about it, there are some other things we want to consider as well. For instance, how close is this experience? Because we value pleasure and pain that happens more immediately higher. That is, it's more a pleasure or pain we experience right now is more important to us than a pleasure or pain we experience a year from now. So propinquity is, you think of it more like proximity, I guess would be a more contemporary word for it. What's the proximity of the pleasure or pain to our current experience? And it looks like the proximity for Jim, if these things are happening right now, we'd give them highly proximate, right? It's within the day. So that's pretty near. So again, we're going to support our negative numbers if we think that this is proximate, and we're going to support our positive numbers if we think that it's proximate on the other end of it. We could do +8 for that too. And then Bill's experience it's going to be nearby, but since it's neutral, he doesn't get a numerical value for that element. And then if Bill is going to have a sort of negative experience to Jim getting to stay for a very long time, how soon does that kick in? Oh, well, actually, since it's about a long-term thing, maybe only a 3 for this. How soon does this negative sense about Jim's getting to stay for a very long time kick in? Well, that's probably going to be, it's going to take a little while, we could presume. And for the kids, how long does it take to kick in that they'll be sad about Jim leaving? Pretty quickly. And how long would the sort of pleasure of him getting to stay take to kick in? It's probably going to last a little while, or it's probably going to take a little while before it really soaks in that he gets to stay sort of indefinitely. So it's not as immediate. And then for Sue, if we kick him out immediately, it's an immediate positive response. Maybe we'll give it an 8 because it takes a day to get him out of the house. It doesn't happen this second. It takes a day or so. And then likewise, when we're trying to decide about her negative response to Jim getting to stay, how long does it take for that to sort of work itself out? Probably not as long for Sue as for everybody else, but still it takes a little longer than kicking him out today. Now, we've talked about the pleasure, how long it is likely to last, how near it is to us, how sure we are about those predictions, but we also have to consider how likely it is that doing this is going to produce more of whatever we're producing, right? That is, how likely is our allowing Jim to stay? Say we allow Jim to stay, that makes Jim happy. We make Jim leave, that makes him unhappy. Well, how likely is it that our allowing him to leave, or allowing him to stay, which makes him happy, produces some pain for him in the future. That's fecundity, right? Or rather, that would be purity. So fecundity is producing more of the same experience. So how likely is it that our allowing Jim to stay right now produces other effects in his life that make him happy? So is he more likely to get a satisfying job, or a meaningful relationship, or buy a nicer car, or watch better TV, or drink better beer, or other things that will make him happier if we allow him to stay? And how likely is our kicking him out to produce things that will also make him unhappy? Right? That is, if we kick him out, is that also going to mean that he ends up with a worse partner, or that he ends up with a lousier car, or a lousier job? Right? Is kicking him out going to be not only this event, but are other bad things going to happen to him as a result of that negative experience? So what's the likelihood of more of the same thing happening? So if Jim has this negative experience getting kicked out, does that make it more likely that other bad things will happen to him? I mean, he's certainly more likely to be sort of victimized in assault, more likely to be crime. Is it more likely he's going to have a worse partner because of it? Well, not if you think this motivates him to get a job, and he gets his own place and sets up his own life. But if you think that's not going to happen, then he ends up at a homeless shelter, and maybe he contracts hepatitis, and a lot of horrible things follow. So in the particular case of the Jim that was on my couch, booting Jim out was not likely to lead to any additional suffering in any real way. He would find some other place to live, and wasn't going to make his life any worse in other ways. He would just have to not be on my couch. He'd move to somebody else's, more than likely. So here, his negative experience is not going to be contributed to by future negative experiences as a result of this one. So kicking him out's not going to cause the harm of kicking him out isn't going to cause him more and different future harms. So we'd say either a 0 here, that is, it doesn't support his negative experience, or maybe even a positive number, because there's really no likelihood of that. So let's just give it a 0 and say, no, he's not going to get any future negative problems from this particular experience. Now, if he stays, does he get some sort of future benefits from that? Is it going to mean he can have a better car, or a better job, or a better relationship, any of these things that would make him happy? And again, it looks like no, because if he gets to stay on the couch, he's really just going to stay on the couch and not get a better job, and not do a lot of the things that would get him, say, the better car or the better relationship or whatever. So again, I want to say that it's kind of a wash as far as producing more of the same. What about for Bill? Right? Now, his initial reaction is neutral. Is he going to get a sort of positive experience from this in some other unrelated way, or maybe a negative experience in some other way if you kick Jim out? Well, kicking Jim out does produce some sort of negative experiences. So in the future, it's going to be more awkward to sort of hang out with Jim. And those are going to be some negative experiences. Right? So maybe a 2, because it may not be awkward for terribly long, but it might be for a bit. And then if Jim gets to stay, sort of indefinitely, that's generally a negative thing for Bill. How likely is it some more negative things are going to happen? That is, how likely is it that there's a sort of slip and fall, or that there's more housework that has to be done, or other negative things that will come up if Jim stays? And again, here I want to say, fairly likely that more negative things are going to come up. So something that would support that initial negative evaluation with some new negative about things that will develop in the future. And then for Ed, Tim, and Jill, the negative evaluation that they would have if we kicked Jim out today, would that be likely to lead to more negative experiences in the future? No, not really. It wouldn't, because Jim's not going to treat the kids poorly for this. And then the positive of Jim getting to stay, how likely is that to lead to more positive things in the future, more piggyback rides, or basket swings, or throwing of footballs? It's fairly likely it would lead to, in fact, more of those sorts of pleasures. And then for Sue, if we kick Jim out today, how likely is that to lead to more pleasures in the future? Not very, right? It doesn't look like that's going to lead to different or new sorts of pleasurable experiences in the future. She's just no longer stuck with having Jim in the house. And then how much more likely is it there's more negative things that would occur if Jim stays on Sue's account? Right? That is, how likely is the negative of letting him stay to lead to more problems down the road? Highly likely. And then finally, how likely is this particular experience of pleasure or pain to lead to the opposite? So right now, it's very unpleasant for Jim to get kicked out of the house. How likely is that displeasure to lead to good consequences for Jim? That is, he gets a job, he gets his own place, he gets his life together. Not terribly, right? Kicking him out of the house isn't terribly likely to lead to those things, but it's possible, right? I mean, there's some chance that will happen. And how likely is the positive experience of getting to stay to lead to problems down the road for Jim? Very likely. You let him live on the couch forever, and a lot of sort of development that needs to occur in somebody's life doesn't happen, right? It's kind of an enabling thing. It's very likely to lead to some sort of negative consequences down the road. And then for Bill, how likely is kicking him out now to lead to something negative or positive in the future? Again, this sort of neutral response. How likely is it that we're going to get something positive? Again, we could just use the numbers from a previous round for Bill. Neutral cases are challenging, but you can work through them. And then for the kids, how likely is it that Tim and Ed and Jill will be will eventually be made happy by their current displeasure at kicking Jim out? Right? So right now, Tim and Ed and Jill are a little sad that we're kicking Jim out. How likely is it that in the future it will make them happy? Maybe it teaches them a life lesson or something like that. So maybe there's a little bit of happiness to be had. How likely is the pleasure of Jim staying to lead to some sort of displeasure in the future? Well, when they become disillusioned at Jim the couch dweller, not Jim the magical super uncle, there's likely to be some significant problems in the future in store if you let him stay indefinitely. And that's in the experience of the children. And then for Sue, she's generally happy if we make Jim leave today. How likely is that to lead to something negative for her in the future? Not very. And how likely is the negative experience of her letting Jim stay to lead to something positive in the future? And again, I want to say not very. So now we've done a sort of calculation for two different options. And of course there are more than two options, because the only options we gave were he can stay forever or we kick him out today. And clearly there are other possible options you might want to consider, or you might think are more reasonable options. But just for the sake of explanation, this is the way Bentham recommends doing a sort of utilitarian calculus. Sit down and systematically think through the we create pro and con lists a lot. Oh, these are the things in favor and these are the things against. And those lists are sometimes not as helpful as they could be. Think of this as a sort of in-depth pro-con list, right? And this is the kind of analysis, the sort of systematic thinking about future consequences that Bentham wants to encourage. He wants us to consider all sorts of different ways that that people's choices can affect others and themselves now and over time. And also how sure we are about them. Economists do just this kind of calculation of desire satisfaction and what kind of things will make people happier. Sociologists and psychologists do also. So there's a lot of disciplines whose study is in large part dedicated to predicting what will produce satisfaction of desire in people. And this is just a sort of a short way to go about doing that kind of thing. So we could figure out our answer here. So should we kick Jim out today? Well, we'd get -8 for Jim, and that would be a -4 for the kids, so that would be -12. And then we'd have a +6 for Sue, so we'd have a -6 for intensity if we kick him out today. And if we let him stay forever, we'd get 8 minus 3 is 5, plus 2 is 7, minus 8 is -1. And then for the duration, we have a -5 experience, and a 0, and another -5 is -10, plus 4 is -6, then 8 minus 8 is 0, we got plus 4, minus 9, gives us a -5, then -9, 0, -8 makes 17, so we get a -8. And then 6 minus 5 is 1, 5 minus 4 -8, 0, -8 is 16, plus 8, so we get -8, and 3, so plus 1, plus 4, minus 2. Then here we've got -2. Trying to run through this quickly. Hopefully you're following. I'm really just calculating down the line the top numbers, adding them all together, and then leaving the answer here, and for the bottom numbers, adding them all together, leaving them the bottom number. 3 cents plus 1 is 7. And finally, 3 plus 2. Okay, so then finally we'll add up all of this bottom row over here to get our sort of final answers for each option, positive or negative, and which one is more positive or more negative. -6 plus -6 is -12, -20, -28, so -28. So if we kick Jim out right now, it looks like we get a -28. It's sort of bad thing to do. It feels like it's not going to be a pleasant situation. And then on the other hand, if we let him stay indefinitely, -6, -10, -19, is a -35. Right? So if the choice is kick him out right now, -28, or let him stay indefinitely at -35, it creates more displeasure to let him stay forever than it would create to just kick him out right now. Now, you notice these are both negative numbers. Of these options, both options lead to unpleasantness. Neither option leads to happy day, right? At least not for everybody concerned on average. And that's what we're working on here. We're taking everybody's experience into account equally, except we have sort of blended the kids together. We should be doing this same analysis for each individual child, but for the sake of time and space, we're condensing. Everybody's opinion counts equally in this situation, and it's just a rough situation, right? It's not a good situation to be in. None of the answers produce happiness, but one answer produces more misery than the other. If we kick him out today, we produce 28 units of misery. If we let him stay indefinitely, we produce 35 units of misery. The majority of which comes from the fact that at the end of the day, it's going to produce this really unhappy experience, even to let somebody stay. It feels good to let him stay. The kids like it. Bill's kind of neutral on it. Jim really likes it. Sue's not really into it, but the long-term effects are kind of so negative across the board that it's probably better to just go ahead and get rid of him, tell him he's got to move out, than to let him stay, even though both choices kind of produce some misery. It's a rough situation, but we have a way to make a choice. And the idea here is we're not just relying on our kind of gut feeling, but rather we're systematically deciding what would produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number. And then doing the math. Whatever answer we get is the answer that we ought to follow on the utilitarian view. Right? The moral thing to do is to do the thing that produces the greatest amount of happiness. So I encourage you to go ahead and give this utilitarian calculus a try. Right? Try it out, see how it works, see how you plug the numbers into some problem in your life. Pick something that comes up where you have a decision to make and you're not exactly sure what to do. Give it a shot and see how it works. It'll at least help you to think through the problem a little bit. And that's really what moral reasoning is about. It's about a systematic way of thinking through moral problems. It gives us some guideposts by which to navigate, rather than just doing whatever everybody else is doing or whatever kind of feels easy or feels right to us. Here we've got a systematic method of thinking about the thing so that we're not reliant on what everybody else is doing, because sometimes everybody else is getting it wrong. And it also moves us away from just doing whatever is kind of easy, because sometimes doing the easy thing is the wrong thing. So give it a shot and see how it works for you, and I will see you all again on Wednesday.